So what's the acronym of the day? It's the CPA. Who knows what the CPA is? The Carbon Pricing of the Americas Declaration. That was actually one of the biggest things that happened at the One Planet Summit last year in Paris. And it was a really thrilling moment for many of us that work on carbon pricing and carbon markets to see leaders from this region step forward, notably the President of Mexico, and launch on the floor of that summit a new collaborative effort to bring forward carbon pricing across the Americas through a cooperative approach of learning from each other and encouraging each other and sharing experiences. So you're quite fortunate because obviously California has been in the middle of this, but it's had a lot of collaborators in it, and we've got some of them on the stage with us today. So I'm Dirk Forrester with AIDA. We're one of the hosts of this event and are really proud to be here with all of you to talk about this initiative. And I actually think it's something where we've a spark sort of went off amongst a set of the players here in New York City last year that led the development of this initiative. But it's something that's got roots now, and it's got work plan, and you're going to learn about it and think about the ways that you can plug in. As with the prior session, we're going to try to reserve some time for you to ask questions or make comments, so be thinking about that along the way. To sort of kick it off, Enrique Lendo is here. He's the Deputy Minister of International Affairs with Semarnat, which is shorthand for the Mexican Environment Ministry, sort of, with other things, but I did okay on that, right? So Enrique, who has, as you can tell, become a friend of many of us that work in this space, has really provided a lot of the leadership in getting this off the ground, because it was Enrique and his team that had to liaise with all the other governments on the language that went into the declaration, and in actually getting it into the hands of President Peña to deliver it on the floor of the summit in Paris. So Enrique is going to kick it off with giving you kind of an update on the genesis of it and where things stand, and then we'll invite the other speakers to come along after that. So Enrique, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dirk. And first of all, very happy to be with all of you this morning in a very important event that we're going to have in the next week. Not next week, but next few days, all this week. And I think this is a key part of the event, because it's about inviting countries and inviting subnational governments and different stakeholders to collaborate in a common goal, which is carbon pricing in this way, and the region in which we're based now. Let me just start with something that we discussed last week in a phone call with Angela, who is leading the CPLC Secretariat. So we were looking at the progress in the different regions, and something that we mentioned was that the Americas is probably, if not the most active region nowadays in terms of carbon pricing, probably one of the most active ones. So we're talking about a very large region, 35 countries, 1 billion inhabitants so far, $21 trillion, which roughly accounts for a little over 20% of the GDP of the world, and a corresponding amount of emissions. 29 countries consider market instruments and something related with carbon pricing in their NDCs, and so far 11 jurisdictions are implementing carbon pricing instruments. A few of them have implemented carbon taxes already. Some of them have implemented ETS, and many of them are considering, and some others have the two schemes, both carbon taxes and also ETS system. Mexico is one of the countries that are thinking about using the two-stage approach. So these are some of the developments that we have in the region. Argentina just started with its carbon tax. We're trying to convince Argentina to join the coalition that we have. But Chile, Colombia, and Mexico have already implemented a tax system, and the 3 countries are thinking about also an ETS system. In the case of Mexico, we're going to begin our pilot next year. At the beginning of next year, we're already doing the rules in order to start this pilot, and probably the ETS in Mexico will be operational by 2021. A lot of development, and probably Martin is going to tell us about this, in Canada, both within the pan-Canadian approach at the federal level, but also in all the provinces. So it's very, very exciting what is going on in Canada, and we have a lot to learn from them. And of course, we have the 2 approaches in the US, the one in the West Coast, the Western Climate Initiative, with the 3 big states there working in an ETS. And we have the RGGI system in the East Coast, with also a lot of state governments doing cooperation in the energy market. Several initiatives are also starting to earmark their revenues, the collection that they get from the tax, and probably in the future from the ETS, in order to destinate those resources to climate policies. That's also very, very exciting, innovating, because it's an approach that a lot of environmental economists have been claiming for a long time. So taking all this enthusiasm into consideration, all this activity in the Americas, we started thinking about developing a common approach for cooperation. And we started with the countries from the Pacific Alliance, which includes 5 countries in Latin America. I'm sorry, 4 countries in Latin America: Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and Peru. And it's a fora which is undertaken at the highest level, at the presidential level, and it's not an environmental fora, it's more an economic and investment integration. So we believe that it was a big opportunity, because it also has a very important private sector component embedded into it. So we believe that there was opportunity to work on carbon pricing and market instruments. And in the summer of 2017, the presidents adopted a declaration with the commitment to collaborate on market instruments. So the idea of carbon pricing was presented to the president. We started talking to the different technical groups within this forum, and then Canada became very, very interested also in supporting the idea, and Martin will tell us about this as well. And then some other partners from international organization, AIDA, and some other colleagues joined. So our goal was to have an idea, a declaration, to be presented at the One Planet Summit on December the 12th. Started the negotiation. It was very important to involve California, because California helped us to also invite some other countries, some other state governments in the US, and then all the provinces in Canada that were doing carbon pricing already joined the negotiations towards the declaration. The declaration was presented at the One Planet Summit on December the 12th. I guess there are 2 main components which are important from this declaration. The first one is that the jurisdictions that adopted this declaration committed to carbon pricing as the central element of climate policy, because it's a very efficient and effective instrument to approach greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So the other part was the measuring and transparency part. So MRV was very important. We needed to understand how each jurisdiction was measuring their emissions. So that was one of the central elements also of the declaration. And the other one was continuity. It was extremely important for us that a platform for cooperation was established. So the CPA that Dirk mentioned at the beginning of this session was another central element of the declaration. So we established this cooperation, carbon pricing cooperation platform of the Americas within the declaration. And this is, of course, a very recent initiative that we launched, but we have been working on it ever since it was adopted in December. And Martin is gonna tell us a little more detail on that. We have had 3 presential meetings and a lot of conference calls, but something we have agreed on is to develop our cooperation in those 5 main components. Common standards and MRV is very important to know, how different jurisdictions are measuring their emissions and the opportunities that we have for reduction through cooperative means. At some point, and this has been a tough one, it might be an opportunity to linking schemes, either ETS systems or taxes at some point. Of course, there are no transnational taxes, but maybe some cooperation that we can promote in fiscal instruments. Competitiveness, what's gonna happen with the competitives in the region. Many of us have engaged in trade and investment agreements, so we're all concerned about carbon leakage and some other things that might threaten competitiveness. So that's another issue of cooperation. Complementary policies, all the policies that we need to put in place in order to have a more effective carbon pricing policy, and also all the policies that might inhibit carbon pricing to come through. And of course, different carbon pricing schemes that are already taking place in the jurisdictions. Are they complementary? Are they not? Can they coexist, carbon tax and an ETS? And then the relationship, the alliance that we build with both the private sector and other important stakeholders is a central element of our cooperation. So that's the reason we have the stakeholder engagement, in which we engage and invite private sector stakeholders and also the civil society. We have already appointed, as you can say, both governments or jurisdictions and also partners who are interested in supporting the initiative as leads of each of these components. This is a little bit of what's going on in Mexico. As I told you, we have 2 important schemes related with carbon pricing. The tax that has been operating in Mexico since 2015. And we have collected roughly $1.3 billion of fossil fuel taxes. We're taxing 7 fossil fuel taxes. We have very ambitious targets under the climate change law. We just reformed the law early this year, and with those reforms, we will have, as I mentioned at the beginning, the pilot of the ETS in Mexico is starting at the beginning of next year. And the other thing that is very interesting in Mexico is the energy reform, and how energy reform has pushed prices of both solar and wind energy down. We have in all the bidding processes which we have had 3 in the last 2 years, we have achieved some of the lowest prices of wind and solar in the world. And those are, as you can tell, the targets that we have in renewable energy, which we believe are very, very ambitious. It's a little more of energy, and I guess that's pretty much it. Martin is going to complement on the progress that we have had so far in more detail, but we're very happy with the initiative. We're inviting different jurisdictions. As a matter of fact, we're hosting, with the help of Angel, Dirk, W. Ryan, and some other partners, a dinner tomorrow. And in this dinner, we are inviting subnational jurisdictions in the U.S., the states from the RGGI initiative. We're also inviting some states from Mexico. We have a few governors here participating in the meeting. And we're open to encourage jurisdictions and some other stakeholders who are interested in supporting this initiative, which we believe is going to make the difference in our region. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Enrique. It's really glad to see in your final slides there sort of brought it back to what it's really all about, which is helping the countries that are involved in this raise their ambitions to be able to meet the NDCs that they have. And in the case of Mexico, I think it was the first country in the world that put forward an NDC that had both a component that it was willing to do on its own if nobody wanted to cooperate, but also an additional amount that it was willing to do if it could cooperate with others. And so I've always seen the CPA as kind of a tangible expression of the seriousness of that interest and that offer. Enrique is co-chairing this effort with, and the government of Mexico co-chairing the effort with the government of Canada, represented here with Martin Lechois. And I'm really glad that you're here, Martin, to give a bit of a sense of what it's like to try to operate this thing. It's just getting its sea legs, I know. One of the things that, after Martin talks, we're going to hear from Juan Pedro Cerro from Chile. This thing was launched in December, as Enrique reminded us. And a month later, the government of Chile hosted everybody to come and let's make sure that we're going to get off to a real start on this without losing any momentum, without losing any time. So at that meeting, I think you were, the government of Canada was willing to step forward and offer to co-lead the effort. So give us a sense of how Canada is intending to gain advantage out of this and achieving your own ambitions, but also like a little bit more operationally, where do you see things currently and where is it going?
Yeah, thank you, Dirk, and good morning, all.
He doesn't look like it, but he just got through negotiating Article 6 for a week in Bangkok. So if he kind of spaces out through part of this, just be patient with him. But go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, I've been drinking a lot of coffee.
Yeah.
So for us, I mean, climate change has no border. We're all in it together, and we need to find ways to work together as well as to supporting one another in these challenging times. And then so to build on what Enrique said in terms of what we committed to with the declaration, the central point is really about implementing a price on carbon pollution. Certainly for us in Canada, it's a central economic and environment policy decision that our government has made, and we believe it's the way forward in addressing broader issues related to climate change. Applying a cost on carbon pollution to guide these public investment decisions is also central to this declaration, the Americas. And finally, this commitment of working together in terms of exploring opportunities to increase alignments, sharing experiences, and developing common standards where it is possible. So building on these commitments, what we also want to send as a signal is that the Americas is a leader on carbon pricing pollution, and also as well as in terms of increasing ambition on climate action. And that's why we need to cooperate and foster this cooperation, not only with the member countries and jurisdictions and subnationals, but as well as with the private sector, NGOs, international institutions. I'm very happy to be sitting here with colleagues from AIDA and the World Bank and EDF, as we see that you can all play an important role in supporting our efforts. In terms of operationalizing our commitment under the declaration, we establish what we call a collaboration platform. And this platform is government-led and has a working group that builds on the core principles. And Enrique kind of gave us a bit of an idea of what are the key issues that we are looking into and that we want to explore. This platform establishes a space for member jurisdictions to work together, advance their respective carbon pricing pollution systems. And And it represents an opportunity for all of us to increase these alignments and in terms of how we move forward, because as you all know, we're all very busy at home in terms of implementing our own systems, and we're all facing our own challenges. And working together, given that there are political cycles and governments come and go, and that's certainly something that we need to be aware of. So the political and the technical challenges in putting carbon pricing in place. And so when creating the platform, it was crucial for us to that our activities be of real value, mutual benefits, and non-duplicative from other forums. And I can think of the CPLC, for example, with the World Bank. And then so this past February, we conducted a survey with all members to understand and kind of take stock of who was around this table, what are the issues that needed to be conveyed, and the type of activities that we needed to undertake. In addition to this work, the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, has authored a paper where they did a bit of an overview of the current environment on carbon pricing in the Americas. And this is really helping us identify what are the gaps and the different issues or angles that we should look into in the future. And based on this, it really informed our last meeting that took place in Mexico in August, where we had a face-to-face meeting. We had these 5 key priority areas that we wanted to engage on, and really trying to understand, okay, what are the key questions that we need to look into? Obviously, this, as was mentioned earlier, was established last December. I mean, it's very little time. And so we had to first identify what are the issues that we need to work on, and then what are the key questions. And then based on this, then there's some work coming up later this year and leading up to 2019. I'm not going to go through the five areas that have been identified by Enrique, but we hope that by addressing these key issues that we can learn from one another. And just to be clear, for us, for Canada, it was important that it was not a one-way street where, I would say, a north-south avenue where there is really a need to engage and learn from one another. And we're all at different stages of implementing carbon pricing. Some have more experiences than others, but we can all learn from one another because we're all facing similar challenges. Also, with the declaration, we establish a governance guidelines, and so how are we going to be organized? How are we going to manage our steps forward, and in terms of the composition of the working group and the platform, et cetera, et cetera. So just so that we can formalize the declaration, because in our view, last December we got the political signal from our political masters, and now we needed to get to work in terms of operationalizing these technical issues. So in sum, as you can see, we've been very busy in the last 9 months. 2 face-to-face meetings, several conference calls, surveys among ourselves to see where we can go. And then so in sum, we've set up the platform for collaboration and its roles and procedures. We've conducted an environmental scan of ongoing work and other forums. We have agreed to focus on 5 priority policy issues areas. We have started unpacking each of these issues together, and we have created a progress report to track the work that we've done and where we're going in the future. Finally, when we look at and Enrique mentioned some of the numbers in terms of who we are in the Americas, but when we look at the membership of the declaration, it represents 280 million people. That's $6 trillion in economic activities each year. So that's important. And I think we need to really gather our efforts and maintain momentum in terms of implementing carbon pricing pollutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. So I want to bring you one more government perspective, and that's from Juan Pedro Cerro from the Energy Department in Chile. And Chile played an instrumental role in helping to produce this declaration and in hosting that first meeting. I'd like to get a sense from you, Juan Pedro, on you are also leading the Chile's participation in the Partnership for Market Readiness at the World Bank. Obviously, the CPA is giving you something additional to work with to help build a program that sticks in Chile. So give us a sense. The other thing that he represents is we've seen elections occurring throughout the region. They're continuing across the Americas over the course of the coming year. And you've already been through that. You've got new bosses now, and give us a sense of where you see things going with the new government, change of party, change in leadership, and are they sticking with the program, or are they going to do something different?
Okay, thank you, and good morning all. I'm happy to be here, and thanks for the invitation. Given that you said that the acronym for today is CPA, we're very excited to be part of the CPA, not only because we are, I'll go to the national point that you raised, but not only because this is a chance to cooperate with each other, but we feel kind of privileged to be part of this because we're sitting together with actual, jurisdictions that are implementing real carbon pricing, and moreover, you have like jurisdiction even trading carbon among themselves. So I think we can nurture our own carbon pricing policy with taking those examples on the table. And you mentioned the PMR. The PMR to us has been instrumental, really instrumental to create knowledge on carbon pricing in Chile, and also to support from a technical perspective and also a financial perspective what is happening right now in Chile. If you talk to people 3 years ago, where the PMR was just starting, not many of them knew about carbon pricing. They were more knowledgeable about, one instrument related to carbon pricing, which was the CDM, but not about carbon tax, not about ETS, and now you can find more people that even can challenge you with a number of questions, how to move forward with this. And it's interesting how a critical mass in Chile has been growing on this. And the PMR, as I said, have been instrumental because with the PMR funding and technical assistance, we were able to implement in a successful way the tax that we have. I don't know how many of you know about the tax. Our tax is a tax on emissions. It's not a tax more upstream, so it added a little bit of difficulty to MRB the emissions instead of just it's easier upstream. But it's also interesting, our tax, because it's tackling CO2, but also it's tackling local pollutants. It's a combination of trying to address local and global pollution with the same instrument being applied to the same sectors, if you wish. And given that, I think one of the challenges of the CPA and also the challenges within our countries is, you mentioned the government transition, right? But in our case, I think it has been even better because the changing government didn't change the pathway on carbon pricing. On the contrary, with the new government, this new government has been more vocal on climate change, more vocal on achieving the commitments under the Paris Agreement, and more vocal in the sense of that we need to pay close attention to the current picture of the tax. If there's any chance of revising the tax and maybe improving the tax, that is happening. And that is happening thanks to the PMR. Why? Why is that? Now, the tax came as part of a big tax reform that now is being revised or being, you say revised? Or it's in revision, under review by Congress. So we took this opportunity to see if there was any chance of improving the tax, and that, I mean, it's been discussed, okay. But part of the proposal that came through all the PMR process are being discussed. One of them, this is public, so you can browse on the Congress webpage and you can find the details. The tax reform is a huge, huge document, but the green taxes are in Article 8. So whoever wants to go there and see the desired changes. So one is the introduction of offsets, which wasn't figured before. So in this case, we look at the example in Mexico, the example in Colombia, and we said, why not us, okay? So it's there. The other big change that we want to make to the tax is that the tax originally was on the installed capacity of certain thermal power generation. And now we're trying to move to an emission threshold, which is more or less the approach used by many other jurisdictions, which we feel is more, it's more fair, we guess so. And I think, and the other figure is that we want to install or put in place a mandatory reporting system in order to catch other potential sources of emission that may be part of the tax. But again, the PMR has also provided a number of alternatives to the tax, meaning this one, a combination of the tax with offset, also a combination of the tax with an ETS. And for that to happen, we have recently launched a public-private roundtable on ETS. I think we had so far 2 meetings. And the aim of that table is to come up with a concrete proposal on an ETS for Chile, to be raised in terms of the level of approval. So yeah, I think things are happening very interestingly. We have another table that it's taking care of how to address the experience so far in Chile with the private sector in terms of these white certificates, the green certificates. So it's all in the same package. So maybe to sum up, I would say that being part of the CPA to us is truly like a cooperative approach under the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. We don't have the rules in place yet. Of course, the CPA members will follow those rules, but nothing precludes us to move forward in parallel, in advance to what will happen in Katowice or maybe beyond Katowice. So,
very good. Thank you, Juan Pedro. So I think the picture you're getting is one of, it's a pretty fair picture about what's happening across the Americas on this topic. And it's kind of interesting. We had in the opening session some question about which is better, tax or trade, which is something, it's an allergy we have in the US, that we have to have that discussion repeatedly and try to think through what are our best options. But in a way, it's really encouraging to look south and to see jurisdictions that have started with tax and then are looking at a progression, as you've described, of adding offsets to the tax to add some flexibility to it, stimulates a market, and then looking forward to how an emissions trading program might ultimately come about that you could link with others, which is obviously what CPA is about. And I think Mexico is on a similar path and passed legislation last year to sort of enable the beginnings of work on a kind of a voluntary trading program to be followed by a more mandatory program going forward. So it's a really interesting models emerging here. And a lot of this, I think, has benefited from support from international community and in a particular case of the World Bank with the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition being able to help encourage more conversation amongst stakeholders and governments on this, but also with the technical support that Juan Pedro mentioned from the Partnership for Market Readiness at the World Bank. We're privileged that Angela Churi Kalhauge is with us. She is the highest ranking Swedish-Kenyan carbon pricing expert at the World Bank. So how about that? And as a wonderful partner for all of us on the platform up here on not just this initiative, but many others. But Angela, if you can give us a little bit of a sense of the kind of support and maybe what you see for your client countries also in this model of cooperation, because it's delivering something different than the technical support that the PMR does and a lot of the bilateral support. It's doing something different. So give us a sense of what you see that's different and what the outlook of this is, not just in the region, but more broadly.
Thank you, Derek. I thought you were going to also add, and the only woman on the panel. Thank you, good morning, and it really is a pleasure to be here. And also to be here to talk about the Carbon Platform for the Americas, the carbon pricing initiative in the Americas, because this was actually one of the big breakthroughs within the carbon pricing space in the last year. This is not only significant because of the very strong political signal that it sent, given that it was the heads of state who signed this declaration, but also because it sent a very strong signal of commitment to work together among the different countries from the north to the south. It's also because it's very inclusive, and that is also the spirit of what the CPLC is. Now, this morning, Mr. Gérard Mestrallet introduced the CPLC, the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, which has its, should I say, origins in the discussions already in 2014, where there was a push to get a strong support for carbon pricing. Now, beyond making a statement, the idea was to bring together leaders who could demonstrate leadership through their actions or their intentions to put a price on carbon. So it has been an advocacy platform where we have worked to build a strong business case, drawing on what others are doing around the world, but also has been a platform where the different partners, and presently we're 250 partners within the CPLC, about 42 are national and subnational, a large number are businesses, investors, civil society, and academia. And I think the beauty of that is these are organizations, jurisdictions that have stepped forward to demonstrate their commitment. So it's not just leadership that we have CEOs or ministers or heads of state. It is leadership through the actions that they take. So why is CPA important for us? Because it takes that advocacy to action. It sort of moves from just talking about what's being done or what could be done to actually getting it done. And I think for us, it really embodies the spirit of what we have been trying to facilitate. I may just want to mention that the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, while hosted at the World Bank is one of the partners as well, among many of you who are here. So it really is a platform where we can promote what all of you are doing and where the different partners can take a lead. So the CPA embodies that spirit of leadership by the different entities. It's also very important because in the last year, and maybe some of you know about the World Bank publication that we do each year, the State and Trends of Carbon Pricing, a lot of the progress globally was happening in the Americas. We're presently up at 51 carbon pricing initiatives that are either being implemented or scheduled for implementation. We saw in the last 12 months, or at least between January and December 2017, a lot of decisions to get things moving happening in the Americas. We're now starting to see movement happening in Asia. These initiatives, of course, also got a boost because many of the NDCs do make reference to the use of markets or pricing. And therefore, for us, the success of the CPA, the success in moving beyond talking about the declaration to actually showing the declaration translating into action, is going to be very important also for other regions to actually see that it is possible to translate these intentions or these proposals into meaningful mechanisms that are actually driving change and generating results. Now, what do I mean by results? I think we saw in Enrique's presentation the context within which the pricing initiatives are happening. And if you look just at last year, one major result is the amount of revenue being generated. Globally, we're talking about 33 billion, which was an increase by 50% from the year before. And with projected revenue generation will even be higher, and not just from the Americas, but other regions. The value of collaboration across borders is not only to foster the joint learning, but also to give a sense of comfort that countries are not doing in this alone. I think there's a lot of opportunity because our economies are interlinked, our societies engage across borders, so it is really important for them to see what's happening elsewhere, what they can learn, both in terms of successes and failures, and solutions that could be taken in that regard. Lastly, I just want to mention the inclusive part of this initiative, which is, it's not just governments. It's led by governments, but it's not just for governments. Mm-hmm. And I know when you spoke about the value in terms of it representing, was it 280 million people? Is that it's also the inspiration it has given, because many of the stakeholders who were already working on carbon pricing got a boost in knowing that there was some political backing to this. And while we know that there is a lot of political transitioning happening with elections across the Americas this year, we're starting to see civil society stepping up as well and becoming that voice that hopefully will carry this work forward, through different administrations, but also in keeping a momentum and an awareness of the opportunities. So in a nutshell, this is one of the very important initiatives, a complement to what we do within the CPLC, and that we hope to continue supporting, and that really lives up to moving from advocacy to real action.
Good. Thank you, Angela. So to round out the perspectives here, Nat Kane is with us, Senior VP for Climate at Environmental Defense Fund. EDF is active in working on market-based instruments all around the globe. I think it's fair to say this is sort of a special one because it's a regional initiative that I think, as Angela's described, and I know Angela and I were together in Nairobi earlier this year meeting with some African government officials from different, from Southern Africa, from West Africa, trying to think about how they could do something similar, like what could we do together to breathe life into Article 6? What could we do together to actually improve our prospects for connectivity with other jurisdictions in the future, and really to get more done together? So Nat, I wanted maybe to ask you to take us to a slightly higher strategic plane, maybe, to talk about, as EDF looks at this initiative, what's in it for you in civil society and sort of in your advancing of the environmental imperative here? And what do you see in this initiative that might be lessons for others to consider?
Well, thanks, Dirk, and thanks to the organizers of the day. EDF is happy to be one of the co-sponsors, and I have to put in a shameless plug for the booth we've got. So instead of telling you all about EDF, I can just tell you to go check out our booth. But EDF has been working on market-based solutions and carbon pricing for about 50 years now, or market solutions for 50 years, and it's because we think that that's going to drive greater ambition in the long run. So our lens, on this and everything we work on is what's going to drive increased ambition, what's going to ratchet up the commitments that countries are able to make, that jurisdictions are able to make, so we can get greater and faster and steeper carbon reductions and reductions in greenhouse gases. And so I think to us, that's the value of the CPA. And I thought I'd say a little bit about, I think, the role that stakeholders can play, not just civil society, but also business. We're working very closely with AIDA on this, of course. And then talk a little bit about the way that I think the CPA can be a model for other forms and other instances of cooperation. Because I really think we're putting together something here, and the governments involved are doing something that can be replicated elsewhere. So on the stakeholder engagement, we heard, I think earlier in the last panel from Mary Nichols, there was talk about the challenges politically of maintaining some of these programs. We've seen that recently in Ontario, for example. And so I think one of the ways, and it's not the only way, but one way to ensure that when we put in place carbon pricing programs that they're durable and effective is to build deep and lasting support among, and engagement among civil society, among business, to make sure that a program has its roots deep, and that there are people advocating for the continuation of it, that there are people pushing governments to be more ambitious, but also that they have an interest in seeing it continue. So I think that kind of early stakeholder engagement in the design and advocacy of carbon pricing programs is a key to ensuring that they're durable and that they're lasting for the long run, and that they're environmentally effective and economically sound, that they take those perspectives into account. So I think that's true, within countries. We've been very, very proud to be working with AIDA and a number of partners in Mexico, for example, working very closely with Semarnat to support and push the Semarnat as they move forward on the development of an emissions trading system, but to be there to provide advocacy, to provide the stakeholder engagement, to provide technical advice where we can, to connect networks of experts from different countries who can facilitate learning. So I think there's really a very collaborative relationship that both civil society and business can have with governments. And of course, in Mexico, we're doing that very closely with ICM and other NGOs in Mexico, with Cespedes and others in the business community. And I think that's a very effective model, potentially for engaging national governments, but then also, I think, for playing the role in helping knit together an effort like the CPA. We can help reach out to civil society or to business in the other jurisdictions and help bring that together. We're building those connections in civil society with Chile and Colombia, and not just NGOs, but academia and universities. And I think that kind of network can strengthen the whole effort. I should also say that I think this is a great showcase for the role that CPLC can play. I think the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition was really valuable here as a platform and to kind of incubate and support this idea. I think it effectively brought together all of the folks who were first thinking about this, and Angela, you and your team helped provide the space for us to kind of work out this idea and hammer it out, and then give, put it out into the world. So I think that role of CPLC has been critical. Let me just say briefly, because I know we want to have time for questions, where I think the CPA can be a model for cooperation more generally. And there's a couple of dimensions here that I think are really interesting. First, I'm an economist by training, and economists have long talked about the importance of linking systems, largely from an economic perspective. I know, Juan Pedro, you're an economist too, so it's all, gains from trade and equating marginal abatement costs. But I think what we're seeing is, and the CPA is a great example of it, there is real political value to international cooperation and to linking carbon pricing systems or other systems because of the political strength and the confidence I think that gives to the jurisdictions and the countries that are involved. I think that's why we saw the participation of heads of state. Hey, if I'm going to move forward with a carbon pricing program, I want to make sure that others are also moving forward. And a regional grouping makes a lot of sense. We haven't talked too much about the sort of origins of this, but really the seed for the carbon pricing, the Americas Declaration, came from the work of the Pacific Alliance, as well as the connections that California had made and that Canada had made with Mexico. And it was sort of putting those two relationships together, taking the Pacific Alliance, the work that had already been done among Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, and that existing grouping, and then expanding it outward, being more inclusive, bringing in California and Canada on the basis of those relationships. And I think that's what made this possible, and it matters that it's regional. It's not accidental that that it's sort of that it's an accidental scattering. So I think it's a good model for potential regional participation or regional cooperation on carbon pricing elsewhere. I think it's a model as well. Dirk talked about the way in which the CPA has just completely gone beyond the questions of cap versus tax, right? Which, used to consume, or sometimes still consumes some of us. But there are jurisdictions that have implemented a tax, maybe are considering adding an ETS or shifting to an ETS. Or other jurisdictions started with an ETS, but the common theme is cooperation. Yeah. And cooperation in the name of greater ambition. And then that's the final thing I'll say is a model for what that cooperation looks like. How do we breathe life into Article 6? I think an important way to breathe life into Article 6 is for jurisdictions that are interested in linking, or in cooperating, I should say, because this is the first, potentially a long road, but jurisdictions interested in cooperating to come together and begin building that common infrastructure, if you will, the common standards, the MRV. That's very important. A model for that, if you will, is RGGI, which did that very early on. The WCI did the same thing. But that model of very early on, even before you're talking about formal agreements or formal relationships, making sure there's the common rules, the common standards that can be a foundation later for increased cooperation. I think that's a really important part of this model. The final test, the ultimate test, I think is going to be whether this raises ambition. And I think that's where we're coming at it. We're not going to, we won't see that 9 months in, but I think when we're, a few years in, when we're looking back, I think the test for whether this has succeeded will be, do we see not only that greater cooperation, but cooperation leading to greater ambition, and I'm hopeful that we can. So, thanks.
Very good. Thanks, Nat. I'm glad you brought us back to that ambition point, because it's interesting. That's sort of where Governor Brown left off this morning. He talked about it's really easy for you people to say delivering climate ambition, but when you really try to do it and you start to confront the political headwinds, it really is, I think, helpful to be a part of a larger band of or a cadre of people that are working on it. If you're in industry and you're set on opposing things, like the very first thing on climate is always to say we're going it alone. Why should we do it when nobody else is? This is the world over. This is true. I think some of our Chinese friends are still here. But I know in China, I've talked to businesses in China, even at the provincial level, it's like, why should we do it in our province if all of the other provinces aren't doing it? It's always your number one thing. And then the next thing is also to characterize, we're just X% of the problem. It's such a big problem, it's not going to make any difference. We're so little. But of course, on climate change, when you band it all together, this was great about your presentation, Enrique, giving us some numbers, and Martin, you reinforced that about doing it together. You're getting at appreciable chunks, and you're actually building that confidence so that you can say, we're not going it alone, we're doing it with others. And that I think ultimately helps you address some of those competitiveness issues, that it's not just one or two jurisdictions, it's a group. Mm-hmm. So it's a really healthy dynamic, I think, that is emerging from this. Okay, so you got a little bit of my take on it. And I think from the business community, I think we also feel one of the values of it is this point that Nat ended on also about the importance of the technical aspects and the MRV, and kind of knowing that you're making progress, but also knowing that you're kind of counting the same in different places, which helps us feel like we're not dealing with a different set of rules every place you go. So this harmonization effort is something we really applaud. Okay, so I have about 19 minutes and 25 seconds left on the clock to involve you folks. So I hope that you've heard something here that interested you, that you'd like to learn more about, or that you'd like to comment on. So I'm going to open the floor. Craig Ebert, my great partner Craig Ebert, is back there with a microphone to assist you. He's a legend in his own time, but he could also just take the microphone and probably dominate the rest of the time if you let him. I'm trying to inspire a hand. Josh, up at the front. Thank you. And who else is going to ask a question before I start calling on people? Okay, get your hands ready. Okay, good. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's a great presentation, and part of the value of the discussion is the focus on regional activities, and that it's if you want to go quickly, go by yourself. If you want to get it done, go in cooperation, go with a group. Angela, could you talk to us a little bit about the value, the importance? We talked about carbon, but I didn't hear anything about co-benefits. Could you talk about co-benefits and how they are important not in just in the bigger picture, but on the ground in terms of getting measurable support to continue with these programs?
Okay.
Good question.
You got that, Angela, or do you want me to allow another question?
I think let's take more questions and
We're
then.
going to take 2 more questions, and then we'll do another round. So there's one in the back, and Craig, then there's one up here in the front on this side. Okay.
Andy Van Horn. This morning we heard about the importance of price stability, and you're talking a lot about linking allowance markets, which is absolutely critical. Could you comment on the role of allowance banking in both preserving price stability or enhancing it, as well as enabling linking between different markets?
Good. Good question. Thanks, Andy. And then one up here in the front, Arthur. Yeah.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Dirk. Arthur Lee with Chevron. A question to the panel, maybe even more so to Enrique. In the work that the CPA is doing, is there any, or I should say, can you characterize some of the conversations governments have in terms of also trade ministries, international trade, not just emission trading, but trade between sectors of the countries? Thank you.
So sort of an impacts on trade. Good. Okay. Angela, do you want to start us out? And I'll turn to any of you on the second one. I'm looking at you, Nat, because I know that you guys have done a lot of empirical work on value of banking. And then maybe all of you would like to comment on this trade issue. Please, Angela.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Josh, for the question. In building the business case around pricing, the value of a carbon price to drive emissions down, of course, is central in very many cases. But sometimes it becomes very difficult to sell that, especially when you're talking to citizens in general or to certain other groups of stakeholders. And what we have found is that the experience of some of the most successful jurisdictions in making the case was relating this also to immediate priorities, the creation of jobs, improvement in air quality because the price provided an incentive for cleaner fuels or more efficiency. The use of the revenues that we have seen in jurisdictions such as Alberta or British Columbia or Sweden that has been recycled either towards climate objectives or through the general revenue system and used for investments in innovation, reskilling of labor, and so on. And what we're finding is that when making that case, you really need to give that comprehensive picture that also captures the whole range of benefits of this policy, but then of course keeping in mind that policies around carbon pricing are not made in a vacuum, but rather are made within the broader context of other sector or regional regulations and policies. So it is an extremely important part of the rationale for pricing, understanding what else does it do, what else does it lead to, and how does it help economies and societies grow. We're finding now, and I think looking at what's happened recently in jurisdictions where there are ongoing debates about whether to keep or whether not to keep the particular pricing policy initiatives, that arguments are moving a little bit away from just talking about the impact on businesses to also the impact on societies. And that's why it's extremely important to start looking at what are those broader co-benefits. What does it do, especially when you talk to the youth? And again, I'm going to shamelessly make a plug for an event we're going to have around higher education and carbon pricing. How do you get the next generation excited about some of these policy measures? It's not because of just the emissions. I mean, that's important because they're worried about the future. But it's also important when you talk about it from the perspective of jobs and job security and new opportunities. So absolutely critical, absolutely central, and definitely something we have to factor in as we advocate and develop these programs.
Good. Yeah. Who wants to take on the question on banking? Nat?
I'll take a quick stab. I also want to say just very briefly on the co-benefits piece. I mean, we're sitting here in a state that has shown lots of the co-benefits that come with a well-defined well-established ETS program in this case. Just even in terms of investment, one of my favorite stats is that California has attracted 40% of all the clean tech investment in the entire country in all the U.S. since the passage of AB 32, and I think that's a benefit in terms of economic investment, economic growth, and jobs, and so on. And then investment in local communities over the course of the program, as I think folks here know, California is generating billions of dollars to invest back in local communities, make sure that the benefits from that clean technology, from the low carbon future, are enjoyed by communities throughout the state. So I think that question about co-benefits is valuable, and that's one of the areas where lessons learned and shared across jurisdictions can really help. I think on the allowance banking and price stability piece, first I should underscore the point, because I may have obscured it somewhat in my talk. This is the big story here about carbon pricing systems so far in the CPA is one of heterogeneity and diversity. I mean, I think that's one of the really interesting aspects of it as a model, that different jurisdictions pursuing different policies, both in the near term, maybe also in the medium term, but still coming together to think about how to collaborate and have common standards, even if some are pursuing a tax, some are pursuing an ETS, some are doing both. So I don't want to say this is all about linking, because it's really about cooperation much more broadly. Having said that, I mean, EDF has certainly advocated for many years some of the virtues of the potential that you get from linking carbon markets, and I think to the extent there are concerns around price stability, you're right that allowance banking can be a buffer for that. I mean, there's lots of we could spend all day on policy design, but again, I think some of the things that you see in well-designed systems, California is a great model again, that have provided a fair amount of price stability while still keeping the focus on the main thing. Mary Nichols mentioned this in the morning plenary. The goal is to drive down emissions. The goal is to reduce emissions and put the world on a transition to a low carbon and ultimately zero carbon future. And so we need to keep the focus on raising ambition, on achieving those targets, and on using whatever carbon pricing policy a jurisdiction wants to implement to meet those long-term goals.
So, Martin.
Sure, I can go on the third one on international trade. So it will be similar to what was said earlier this morning in the first session. The earlier discussions that we've had within the CPAs really focus on competitiveness and carbon leakage. That's the angle that we're looking at. There are some domestic work being done, like for example in Canada, as part of our Pan-Canadian framework on clean growth and climate change. When it was adopted, it was also agreed that competitiveness studies would be done along the way to help inform how these policies would evolve. And so that's really the angle that we've taken. Now, we just started. That's one of our priority area that we need to look into. But we agree that we would share best practices and the result of the different studies that we're doing domestically. In terms of linking and convergence of different pricing. Now, as we've heard this morning, there are different approaches to putting price on carbon pollution. But the issue that's central to us is how those can interact with one another. You may have an ETS in place, and if you bring a carbon tax, can one or the other, one complement the other, and if so, how? And that's also an area where we need to discuss and do further research and studies. Finally, I wanted to react to the issue of MRVs and how important that is. And Canada's been working with the countries of the Pacific Alliance on MRV and in terms of standardizing. And this brings up this importance of having common standards. We believe in Canada that by having common standards, it can help drive ambitions, but also investments. Businesses want to know where they're putting their money and the results, how are they going to be generated. But it also brings me to the importance of the Paris Agreement and then the Enhanced Transparency Framework that is being negotiated at the moment, and how we put in place the right systems where all countries or parties to the Paris Agreement in this case will be reporting their data in a way that it's clear and transparent. Because in the end, as it's written behind me, you know, how do we drive ambition and how do we increase that ambition across the board? And carbon pricing is one of the tools that we use, but they're all technical issues that needs to be addressed. So.
Enrique, do you want to touch on the trade point?
Sure, just compliment, but I think Martin gave a good answer. Competitiveness is a trade point. I guess just put this into context. For the last 30 years, we have had two different global processes, but two of them have been very important. Yes, the first process, and this is one of the issues we're talking about, is our engagement in climate policy. So from the UNFCCC and implemented that, the Kyoto Protocol, and then we started a new negotiation towards Copenhagen and then Paris. And a lot of countries, you see a lot of changes at the national level, many of them driven by international commitments, but most of the countries that you see out there, the G20 countries that account for roughly, almost 90% of the greenhouse gas emissions, have implemented active climate policies. And in that way, of course, there have been concerns on competitiveness, carbon leakage, and many other issues because they are integrated to the world trade and investment system. So that's a process that we have seen and we can talk about, and we've seen different stages within this process. Now we're doing the NDCs, and within the NDCs, different policies out there, carbon pricing being one very promising there. The other part is the trade and investment system. So after the challenges that we had with the implementation of the Uruguay round and then the Doha round, which some people say it collapsed, you see a proliferation of FTAs throughout the world. And if you look at the Americas, it's probably one of the regions with the largest number of FTAs. The case of course, we started in 1994, the first international trade agreement that integrates the North with the South in the Americas, the US and Canada and Mexico. And now we're working in the modernization of that for the last, year and a half. We've been working on that. But not only that, I mean, the Pacific Alliance is an example of trade and investment taking place in the South. So it's not only North with South, but many of the southern countries doing that. There's also the Andean Trade Alliance and many other processes. So, of course, a concern is what's going to happen if we want to implement not only carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is, of course, a major challenge within climate policy because it operates immediately and very effective. So there's nothing you can do about when a tax system is implemented. So what Martin said, the competitiveness and having companies and the business sector within the Pacific Alliance kind of, we're not going to say happy, but like a list open to discuss this issue was very important. So we're taking that into as an advantage. And I'm also, for instance, sitting in these negotiations of the modernization of NAFTA nowadays. And
does he look like a NAFTA negotiator?
When you look at both sides, and you look at the issues we're addressing, we're not talking much about climate within those negotiations, but we're talking about environmental policies that might affect competitiveness. So there you have a way to make sure that once policies are climate or environmental policies are implemented in the country, you make sure that it has the least effect in competitiveness. So I guess that's the key, competitiveness. One important part is not to be afraid of engaging in these policies because competitiveness issues can be addressed through national or also trade and investment policies. And the other part is the one that Martin said, and also I believe net. Are there opportunities not only for not affecting competitiveness, but for enhancing competitiveness within the region through cost reduction, through co-benefit, through some other benefits that might come from engaging in a cooperative way and making sure the rules are very, very solid and can be implemented and enforced. So that's, I guess, that will be some of the approaches that we've seen there.
That's great. Thank you, Enrique. And it is interesting, just as you were speaking, Jen, kind of reflecting that this whole initiative, and Nat mentioned it earlier on, it grew out of the Pacific Alliance's work just in the South, which I think Canada's observing maybe, and I think New Zealand's an observer to that, but it really grew out of this interest on the trade side of bringing in an environmental and a climate component. So interesting how those two worlds work together. Thanks for that. I think we've got time for one or two more questions, although I actually was going to take a chair's prerogative, and I'm going to ask a question of the audience, which is, Craig, hang on. You're close, but right over here, there's the co-chair of the Article 6 negotiations there. See, she's shaking her hand. I wanted to wake her up. Kelly Kazir is here from the government of Ireland via New Orleans. And Kelly is, I'm just curious, as the, one of the co-parents of Article 6, does this give you pause or does this encourage you? What do you think?
I mean, there was a while there where everybody thought our baby was ugly. I think people are starting to think it's as attractive as we think it is. So it's encouraging.
Very good.
Okay, do you want more? I knew you would do this, by the way. I knew it. I was trying
You
to
knew I would do this. Well, good.
No, it's very encouraging. And I
You
think
assumed the
that's the
risk.
point. This is bottom-up action, and we're just trying to make sure that that can be counted. We're no longer trying to drive all the action from the UNFCCC. Rather, we're just trying to ensure that the UNFCCC can reflect what's happening on the ground in countries.
Thank you for that. And I did want to kind of bring it back to sort of this broader international frame of that's the article that more so than any other encourages this type of cooperation. So what I'm going to do here at the end is come back to the panel for your closing remarks on this. We'll keep it fairly tight, but I'll go to Martin, then Nat, then Juan Pedro, and then back across to Angela and Enrique.
Yeah, thanks, Dirk. I would echo the comment from Kelly. And that's certainly what Canada's been advocating in negotiations, where we see that countries or parties to the Paris Agreement can come together in a relationship where they trust one another. They can work together to achieve greater ambitions and more reductions. And they'll do it in a transparent way for the greater, global goods of reducing global emissions. And that's what we're trying to set up with Article 6, trying to set the guidance, the rules, modalities, so that these activities can take place in a responsible manner with legitimacy, but where we enable action.
Very good. Thank you, Martin.
Thanks, Dirk. I'll echo some of that as well. I want to go back to what I said about this as a model for regional cooperation, for international cooperation on carbon pricing and on climate action. Generally, I think we've touched on a lot of those aspects, the trade links, the regional nature of it, the participation of World Bank and different stakeholders. We could talk about the participation of jurisdictions across different levels with California and some other states and provinces, as well as the national governments. So there's a lot that's really groundbreaking here, and I think is a model for others. But I think this point about the complementarity between the Article 6 process and the UNFCCC negotiations and this kind of regional cooperation, that's really important, because this won't succeed. The carbon pricing of the Americas won't succeed if there's not a strong foundation of transparency and clear accounting and common understanding that's established in Article 6. And if there is that foundation, groups like this carbon pricing can go beyond, the carbon pricing of the Americas can go beyond it to talk with each other about common standards that go beyond that. But you've got to have that foundation established. So we're looking to you, Kelly. And to the rest of the government.
Juan Pedro?
So, yeah, thank you. So I would say that the CPA is an unprecedented regional effort on carbon pricing. So we can, at the same time, be nurtured or follow the Article 6 rule book, but also, hopefully, we can also nurture a future negotiating process by real, experience on carbon price. But I would like to finish by saying that we we're doing things wrong in terms of communicating carbon pricing. I mean, Josh kind of made the question. I mean, what are the co-benefits? So we tend to explain carbon pricing to our ministers, but explaining all the, the difficult part of it. How much it will cost, do we have the data, et cetera, instead of putting, the balance, all the co-benefits. For example, the use of revenue, that's essential. Yeah. So I think we need to think on how to communicate, of course, work on all the technicalities which are needed, but not this to communicate to higher level decision-making. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. Angela?
Well, I think much as what I would have loved to say has been said, but I think it's important to recognize that the CPA is not an end in itself, but it's the start of the next level of engagement and the kind of engagement that will not only give value to the efforts that are ongoing, but hopefully will drive the ambition in the long term. So I think it's a space to watch, but also a space to engage. So those who are interested, many ways to engage. You can start off also by reaching out to us in the CPLC if you have interesting ideas, experiences, so that we can make sure that we can link you to also the partners who are active in the platform. And then lastly, it's an inspiration for other regions. Yeah. Hopefully, when we do meet again in a year or so, we will have some good news to report from Asia, who are looking very closely at this example to see if there's something in it also to bring together some of the countries there.
Great. Enrique.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm going to pretty much agree with everyone. Be a little less diplomatic maybe than Martin. This is the way Mexico is. We're very engaged into international processes, like any international process which is good for a country and for the world we're probably part of. But on the other hand, we tend to favor or complement processes that are both effective and timely. So when global trade processes are having challenges or not working, we look for different approaches. We engage into FTAs. We've been doing the UNFCCC for years. We're running out of time, so we look at different approaches. That's the reason we're so actively participating in this. We're not saying that one is going to substitute the other one. We believe are complementary, but you both, Martin and Nat, mentioned something very important. We need action, and we need timely action. So that's the reason we're engaged in this. Yeah. The other part is we have also realized that whereas governments have a leading role in this, it's extremely important to work with the stakeholders as equals. So that's the reason I enjoyed this process. That's the reason I wasn't in Bangkok with Martin and other guys, because I believe these processes, which are led by the private sector, which are also supported by international organizations, which have a very, very important engagement of civil society, are extremely important. Why? For two reasons. One, they help us give continuity in times of political change, and that was mentioned by many of the people there, and they enrich our approaches. So that's key. That's key in order to bring effective action. Of course, being a government official, a diplomat, it's important. When we get into negotiations, we need to be very careful about words. We need to be very careful about many things that we are trying to find a balance. But in the end, we're probably all seeking after the same goal, which is a world which has less emissions and a world which is probably better than the one we have in terms of economic and in terms of well-being in many other aspects we're all seeking after. Thank you.
Very good. So you folks look hungry. It is lunchtime, so we're going to draw this to a close, but that is how carbon pricing in the Americas is going to help deliver more ambition. So I hope you got a good taste of it. And if you're interested in getting involved, get in touch with any of us up here, especially Angela at CPLC is providing a lot of focal point, but obviously with civil society, EDF is leading part of that. If you're private sector, talk to me, because we have, especially if you have assets in the region and would like to engage in some of this, please let us know, because we're looking for more partners. So with that, you can go to lunch. And please join me in thanking the panel.